it going live. We're ready to go.
Great. All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Our guest tonight has been a journalist with the New York Times since 2004, having worked as a diplomatic correspondent, White House correspondent, and most recently as a Pentagon correspondent. She was also a member of the New York Times reporting team that received the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting for coverage of the 2014 Ebola virus epidemic in West Africa. It's my great honor to introduce Helene Cooper, who will be speaking to us tonight about journalism and pandemics in an era of media distrust. Thank you. Helene, over to you.
Thank you very much, Leanne. It's great to be here. I'm honored to be able to talk to you guys during this insane time that we're going through. And although my editors are yelling at me literally today, I'm going to just shut them out for the next hour. It's actually really lovely to just be able to take a break from the noise outside, which has been a little hectic already this week. I cannot believe that it's only Tuesday. This is a little bittersweet for me because I so wish that I could physically be at your extraordinary campus. All my years in journalism, I've always wanted to be able to brag that I got invited to speak at Oxford, and now that I finally do, it's Zoom. But I wanted to be able to do this while my namesake, Anna Helena Herzog, was still at Oxford and still a student. And since we don't know how much longer we will be enduring this pandemic, I figured Zoom would have to do it. I hope you guys are all staying safe and navigating this strange and extremely challenging time that we're living in. I was trying to figure out what to talk to you about today. Should I do journalism in the time of coronavirus? How to get scoops when you're either working from home, like I am so often, or so masked up in the streets that no one can actually hear you. Yesterday, for instance, my colleagues and I were working on a big scoop. We got a tip that President Trump had last Thursday asked his top national security advisors for options for a military strike against Iranian nuclear facilities. These national security advisors talked him out of it, but it was just the sort of thing that so many people have been afraid might happen in the last 2 months of Trump's presidency. We worked hard to confirm it. At one point, I had all 3 phone goings with sources who would only talk to me over encrypted phone lines. It was insane. But we got the story in the end. Hopefully, we will continue to find ways to keep adapting to these times. Back on March 13th, the New York Times sent us all home for what we thought would be a month or two. Now we're told that the earliest we'll be back in the newsrooms is July 2021, if that. So it's meant shifting how we report. I'm on phone calls a lot, Zoom calls. I cover the Pentagon, and I still go to the building, which has been opened at a reduced capacity. Everyone is masked up there, but not everyone is as compliant as we might like them to be. I meet sources outside, in parks, on my back deck in the summer. Now it's getting a little cold for that, so it's a return to the encrypted phone calls with some of my more paranoid sources and Zoom calls with everybody else. But no one wants to listen to me whine about COVID for half an hour. So I thought I'd talk to you about how journalism has changed for me from the Barack Obama administration to the Donald Trump administration. I'm a national security reporter, so I don't get as far into politics as some people, as you guys might like, but I'll limit, what I talk about to what I've sort of lived. During the Obama administration, my beat was the White House with a focus on national security. After a few years doing that, I moved to cover the Pentagon beat, which I did for the last 2 years of Obama and then for the entirety of the Trump administration. As a journalist, I spent most of my career focused on how best to write a story that is filled with details and that brings to life through intimate recollections what the people who run the government are doing. I've often found that to be where my specialty, such as it is, lie. That was one of the most important jobs to me as a reporter, to paint a picture for readers of what it feels like for the people who are making these decisions, what it tastes like, what their day-to-day is like. My job, I thought, was to show the human beings behind all of the news that was unfolding. When I went, for instance, to Liberia during the 2014 Ebola epidemic, I didn't write about how every day the numbers of those people getting sick and dying were going up. In America, people had been asking me, why are the Liberians touching each other if they know that Ebola is transferred via touch? Just don't touch anyone. So I went to Liberia and drilled down on why it can be so hard not to touch someone. I wrote about the woman, Precious was her name, who got Ebola from her 2-year-old daughter, Rebecca. You can't tell a mom not to touch her sick child. Or the young man, Ephraim Dunbar, who got it from his mom, who he was feeding after she got sick. It's easy to avoid touching strangers or friends, but it's so hard not to touch a sick loved one, as we're finding out ourselves now with COVID. So back to how I saw my job during the quaint times of the Obama presidency. I will center it around one story. Back in 2011, on the day after they announced that Navy SEALs had caught and killed Osama bin Laden, the New York Times assigned me and Mark Mazzetti, our CIA correspondent, to write the TikTok about how it happened. We had 8 hours to pull it off. In journalism, the TikTok is what editors call sort of a reconstruct. That's why they say TikTok. It's supposed to read like a minute-by-minute chronology of important events that have just taken place, so that you feel like you're right there. Except in this case, the editor said specifically that they wanted this story to read like a spy thriller. They wanted to take the reader all the way from the beginning, when CIA operatives in Abbottabad, Pakistan, identified the courier in his pickup truck who was feeding stuff and transferring stuff to the Osama. And they wanted it to bring the story all the way to the moment when President Obama walked into the East Room of the White House and announced to the world that Navy SEALs had killed Osama bin Laden. The editor said that Mark would handle the CIA part and I would handle the White House part. That made sense because of our beats. But I knew that meant that I would be at a disadvantage because Mark would be getting all the fun Jason Bourne stuff and I would be getting the boring meetings at the White House. What made it worse is that the executive editor of the Times then said specifically, this story better not be full of boring meetings at the White House. He wanted details. I had learned that lesson the hard way. I grew up in Liberia. My family ran away in 1980 after a military coup overturned the government. I spent the next 20 years remaking myself in the United States as an American journalist, trying to escape what had happened to me. In Liberia, my mom had been raped, my father had been shot, my uncle had been executed on the beach by firing squad. But what happened to me, and my whole family had fled what really was a horrific time. I spent years after that trying to shut out what had happened to me in Liberia and trying to become this new American person. That's not healthy. You can't cut off who you are. It took me years to realize that. Finally, after 23 years, I went back to Liberia. I found a sister that we had left behind in Liberia. And finally, I started to reconcile with my own past history in Liberia, with what we, my family, had done ourselves to contribute to what had happened in Liberia. And I wrote this book. It's called The House at Sugar Beach. The first draft I wrote in a year. I turned it in to my book editor, Mary Sue Rucci, who gave it back to me and said, I'd written a draft that was just the facts. I'd written it almost like stenography, trying to divorce myself from the emotion of my own life. My mother's rape, she was gang raped by soldiers who she submitted to in order to stop them from raping my sisters and myself. I had written that in one paragraph. My editor said, people won't care about this unless you go back and describe the scenes in depth. You have to put the details in. Even, she said, if confronting the emotion is too much for you to handle, you can do a workaround by focusing on details of a scene. For instance, like my mom afterwards, locking us up in her bedroom and sitting in a chair all night while we tried to sleep with a gun in her lap. The details, my editor said, can get you to the emotion if you're struggling with how to face it yourself. I had buried so much of this stuff inside me, not wanting to relive it, but I went back again. It took 3 more years of writing and rewriting with more and more detail before I could get to the point where I was satisfied with my book. I had to do the same thing now with this story about Osama bin Laden. I had to get to the details that would make our readers engage. I went to the White House that day to talk to White House officials. They were horrible. They were so busy trying to build Obama into some Superman that they kept telling me the same boring stuff. We had a meeting. The president was resolute. Then we had another meeting. He said that it was a top national security imperative to get Osama bin Laden. I mean, this was like the kind of standard stuff that A, is not really true, and B, captures nothing. Finally, I went downstairs at the White House to the basement, where the top national security aides had their offices. I had one source who I knew that if I could wrestle to the ground, could get me what I needed. He's good because he's one of those frustrated writers. He thinks cinematically, so he's very good with details. I sat outside his office waiting for 2 hours before he could see me. He told me that he was too busy, but I refused to leave, even though I was on deadline for my story. Finally, he let me in and closed the door. He gave me the details that I needed for my story. For instance, he told me about how none of Obama's advisors could agree on what to do. They were all arguing. The defense secretary, Robert Gates, didn't want to send the Navy SEALs in. He thought it was too dangerous. He wanted them to just bomb the compound from the air. Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, said no. She wanted the USA to wait to make sure it really was Osama, maybe consult with the Pakistanis. Leon Panetta, the CIA director, was pushing the Navy SEAL option. He didn't want to wait. The CIA had been struggling, looking for bin Laden for 10 years and hadn't found him until now. He wanted vindication for his agencies. My source was describing these great meetings, actually, where they're sitting around the table in the Situation Room arguing about what to do. That same week, Washington was a mess. The big story was Obama's birth certificate. Donald Trump was in fine form about that. That Wednesday, Obama released his long-form birth certificate. That was the same day of a big Situation Room meeting on Osama bin Laden, though we didn't know it at the time. So Obama walked out of a meeting talking about whether Navy SEALs would go into Pakistan to target and kill Osama bin Laden, who we had been looking for more than 10 years, and then appeared before a White House press conference to release his long-form birth certificate. It was an insane juxtaposition. Obama later again met with his national security officials on the bin Laden case. Everybody ran around the table again, making the same arguments. Obama said, "I'll make up my mind shortly." That Friday, he was about to leave for Alabama and then Florida for the space shuttle launch. Before he got on the helicopter, he called 4 of his aides over. This was in the dining room. They all got their briefing books together again because they thought they were going to have to brief him again on bin Laden. He cut them off. "It's a go," he said. Then he walked out and got on the helicopter. That Sunday, they were all at the White House again in the Situation Room watching a video TV screen of the raid. You've seen the picture. Obama sitting around the table with Biden, Hillary Clinton. I asked my source, what was the atmosphere around the table like? He said tense. I needed more than that. How tense? I said, give me details. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, Joe Biden was fingering rosary beads. That was it. That was the kind of detail I needed, that these men and women were sitting around the table watching the hit they had just ordered up on Osama, the guy they had been looking for 10 years. And Biden was so nervous he was fingering rosary beads. I knew that sort of detail is what would stand out. You've all heard the story about what happened when the Navy SEALs got to the compound, how their helicopter stalled, how they shot the courier, then Osama's son, as they made their way to the third floor where they thought but weren't sure that that was where Osama was. But that part of the story was way too dramatic to be my responsibility. That was Mark's. My responsibility was the story of what was happening inside the White House, where they were all gathered around the table watching the video screen. They had ordered food from Costco, turkey wraps. My source said it took them 30 minutes before they even realized that Osama was actually in the house, that the SEALs were in the right house. How did they know? I asked. He looked at me for a long time. I could tell he didn't want to answer. And then finally he said, we'd given him a code name, Geronimo. I said, are you kidding me? You named Osama bin Laden Geronimo? So the Navy SEALs are at the house. The one who was the lead SEAL is talking into his radio to mission control back home. And Panetta is listening and dictating what he's saying back to Obama and the rest of the officials around the table. So Panetta said, we have a visual on Geronimo. A few minutes pass. Then Panetta said, Geronimo, EKIA, enemy killed in action. A long silence. And then Obama said, we've got him. It took 4 years of me sitting outside that office and then pestering, 4 hours, sorry, not 4 years, of me sitting outside that office and then pestering my source to get the details I wanted. But I held up my lame end of the assignment. And it's weird how something as simple as someone figuring a rosary bead can add to a story and still stay with me today. I was thinking about that as Joe Biden declared victory in the presidential race a couple of Saturdays ago. And I watched him in that speech and I just kept seeing him fingering those rosary beads the day they killed Osama. Fast forward now to last year, October 27th, 2019. I was at home that weekend when President Trump suddenly announced that a daring American commando raid in Syria culminated in the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State, after a 5-year international manhunt. Last night, the United States brought the world's #1 terrorist leader to justice, President Trump said in a formal announcement in the East Room. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. Mr. Trump said that al-Baghdadi was chased to the end of an underground tunnel by American Green Berets, pursued by military dogs. Accompanied by 3 children, al-Baghdadi then detonated a suicide vest, blowing up himself and the children. I'm writing all this down, filing my story. But then, Mr. Trump said, and I quote, that the ISIS leader was whimpering and crying and screaming all the way. You know how some details you can kind of tell are right and some just sound off? This one immediately sounded off, especially when President Trump added he died like a dog, he died like a coward. The president, I had already learned, often likes to compare the worst things to dogs. Still, he's the president, so we put what he said in the paper. But then after, I went to the Pentagon and I started asking questions. I couldn't find a single Pentagon or military official to confirm for me that Baghdadi was whimpering and crying and screaming before he blew himself up. Defense Secretary Mark Esper, who monitored the raid along with Mr. Trump in the Situation Room the day before, said he knew nothing about any whimpering. And other officials said it was not possible to hear anything like that on the overhead drone footage that the president watched. But they said maybe Mr. Trump might have gotten that detail from commanders on the ground. So the next day, I went to General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the most senior military commander. Did Baghdadi die whimpering and crying and screaming? I asked him. None of these guys wanted to contradict the president. So all General Milley would say was that he didn't know. He hadn't heard that. No one he had talked to gave him that information. He didn't know where the president got that from. In a span of 2 days, the story about American Green Berets finally getting the ISIS leader had changed completely to one about why did Trump make up details about how Baghdadi died? Why embellish something that's already dramatic? Why add details that aren't true? Fast forward 2 months later to New Year's 2020. Trump orders a strike on Iran's most senior and revered military leader, Qasem Soleimani, who is blown up right after he arrives at the airport in Iraq. Trump says that Soleimani was planning imminent attacks on Americans. The reaction is immediately skeptical. Soleimani has been planning attacks on Americans for years. That's what he does. Why take him out now? No one was buying it. Within a day of what President Trump thought would be a triumphant announcement, he's under siege from reporters, lawmakers, you name it, all wanting to see the intelligence that showed that Soleimani was planning an imminent attack. The story flips. It was never really about a president protecting Americans by launching a preemptive attack, but now it is only about how Trump has not managed to back up an assassination of a foreign military leader with any facts about any imminent threat. For a week after, that's all I wrote, story after story in which I interviewed officials trying to get them to elaborate on the supposed planned attack that triggered the assassination. They never really did. They kept saying, believe us, there's intelligence, but we just can't show you, we can't tell you. But by now, trust had been so eroded that there was nothing left there to accept. Somebody that tells you, believe me, but you feel like you've been down a road with them before that has ended up in a bad place. You're not gonna just accept their word for it. I was now, as a reporter, not even bothering with details. Details seem so quaint, like journalism from a different time. I'm going to stop here. I know 20 to 30 minutes on Zoom can feel like 3 hours anywhere else, but I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Helene. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. We're going to open up now to Q&A. So for everyone watching, if you're in the call, please use the raise hand function and we'll go over to you. And if you're on our YouTube live stream, feel free to type in a question and we'll go from there. So the first question that we have is going to come from Clara Lindstrom. If you'd like to go.
Yeah. All right. So thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I would like to perhaps ask a bit more about how the tone has changed in journalism and the impact on your profession, since that has been discussed in society, that the political rhetoric has changed. And so how has that impacted your profession, and how have you noticed a change in political discourse from the Obama to the Trump administration?
When you say tone, who are you referring to? Are you talking about reporters, or are you talking about the public?
I would say sort of the merging of the two. So if the discourse of politicians has impacted the public discourse, and if that has impacted the media discourse, so sort of how the three parts, the media and the public and then the politicians, are impacting each other in political discourse and rhetoric.
Well, I think you hear what the politicians are saying, so you don't need to tell me where that tone is. When it comes to the public, the American people just came out of an election in which President Trump won 72 million votes and counting, second only in the history of votes cast to Joe Biden, who is closing in on 80 million. So, and by challenging sort of the legitimacy of that election, he has managed to convince so many of his supporters that actually he was cheated. And so you hear that sort of divorce from fact type of rhetoric all of the time now. The whole idea that you can conjure up your own alternate realities sort of feels like it might be here to stay in the United States, and that's a scary thing. It's a scary thing for me as a journalist because I rely so much on facts. But it's also a scary thing for me as an American citizen when you feel like so many of the people who you're talking to just are not operating on the same playbook that you are. When it comes to the tone of journalists, that the media is a word that that encompasses so many different entities now. There's television, there's newspapers, there's the internet. I can tell you that at the New York Times, we've been having all sorts of debates about tone and about language and about what we can say. It was a big deal, for instance, at the New York Times about when can we use the word lie in reference to President Trump. Our editor, executive editor, Jean Baquet, was constantly fighting back, pushing back reporters who wanted to just say lie instead of writing around this. Trump stated an untruth, Trump stretched the truth, Trump did this. And we all, so many of us wanted to say, look, if it's a lie, just call it a lie. And Dean's argument was, if you keep using the word, you're going to take away its meaning and it'll devalue the word when you do use it. Whether that's true or not, that's definitely one of the arguments that we've had at the Times about how our discourse should be, presented in the newspapers. I could go on and on, but this is such a broad subject. I guess I'll stop now and go to the next question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Edward Howell, who writes, "You talk about how some of Trump's advisors did not want to contradict him and have covered a plethora of stories on North Korea, including a recent discussion with Stephen Biggan. What did you learn, therefore, about Trump's North Korea policy?"
Most of what we've learned about Trump's North Korea policy we've put in the paper. We started off in 2017 terrified that he was going to go to war, that he was somehow, that he and Kim were going, were so escalating with their Twitter feud and the Rocket Man and Dotard and all of that, that I was still covering this from the Pentagon. And at the time it was Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, that there were times at the Pentagon where they were really seriously afraid. They were running these tabletop exercises about, that you would never even conceive that we would actually be thinking about entering a war with North Korea. And when you're looking at another nuclear state, it gets scary real fast. I remember going with Jim Mattis to the DMZ in 2017 in November, and we flew by helicopter to the DMZ, and you could just look down and just see how densely packed that area was, all the way from Seoul to the DMZ. You see apartment blocks and you see people, and it was just like, the pure human scale of what the Trump administration was talking about, was the potential repercussions were frightening. So I think a lot when in 2018, when suddenly we had this exchange of letters and things suddenly started to get warmer, there was initially a lot of relief. Just, we weren't talking about going to war again. There was like the pressure came off, and I think there was a huge sigh of relief in the United States. But the other flip side of it is that Trump had then formed a warm relationship with Kim, and the two of them were getting along and, having summit meetings. And you still had John Bolton, the national security advisor there, who's moving the goalposts in a way for what he wanted the North Koreans to do. And in the end, there was no real deal to be had. Steve Biegun is probably one of the most firmly grounded officials in the Trump administration. I think he's done a really good job of keeping us from getting unnecessarily hot in North Korea. But I would say that we're still at the same place now, perhaps, on North Korea policy that we were 4 years ago. But in Trump's defense, nobody has made that much progress with North Korea. I mean, Obama certainly didn't, and neither did George W. Bush.
Thank you. Our next question comes from William Evans.
Thank you. Hi, thank you very much, Helene, for a really interesting talk. Funnily enough, I was giving a big talk in Oxford today on both Bin Laden and Baghdadi, so it's very interesting to hear your colour and illumination on that subject. Can I ask you, though, with your extensive coverage of the White House and the Pentagon and the American government, what is the reputation of the British in America? We are obsessed here about what we call the special relationship. When you're covering the White House and covering the Pentagon, do the Brits ever really come up? Over.
All the time. The Brits are my best sources. And that's been the case both with Trump. It was the case with Obama. It was the case with George W. Bush. It's weird to explain. I mean, I'm not talking about the public, what people saying out there. I'm talking about when you're a reporter and you're trying to build a case of what the United States government is about to do, and they don't want to tell you. They're always going to be trying to keep it. So you start from the outside and build your way in. At least that's one of the things that I do. And I learned very early on that there's certain governments that have a better idea of what the United States is about to do. So I can start, when I finally go to whatever American administration I'm covering, I'm starting from a position of strength. And now I know a little bit. And so I often start with my British sources because they're in the room all the time, no matter what the administration is, no matter who is in charge, whether it's Republican or Democrat, the Brits are there. They're like, it's an assumed. So no matter, I know there are a lot of times people talk about this relationship, but even in the case of Boris Johnson and President Trump, I still have found British diplomats to be my very best sources. They are up on what is going on. And there is a level of trust between American administration officials and the Brits that just, you can't touch.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Matthew. If you'd like to go, Matthew.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned, first of all, fantastic talk. You mentioned that trust was eroded, particularly when asking about Soleimani and them kind of saying that this intelligence report exists. Presumably they were saying, it's classified, we have to protect sources and methods, et cetera. Have you found that their answer to your questions has changed in previous administrations? Or is it just the nature of how they've responded that has changed for those sort of classified questions when you're trying to dig into that as a journalist?
There are a lot of classified things you're never going to get. If it's intel that's going to compromise, the source, the source from which this intel is coming, they're never going to tell you. They're never going to say we have, this and Israeli agent in such and such a place, or we've got this guy with the Shia militias who told us. They're never going to do that because that's going to compromise their intel. So we don't expect that, but we do expect a certain level of, we were able to find some satellite imagery that showed some movement of something. There are ways that you can do things, but we were just getting point blank, no, we had the intel, but we can't tell you that there. And the problem with that is the Soleimani has been planning attacks against American interests for 10 years. President Bush looked into the whole idea of taking out Soleimani, and they concluded at the time that this is not a good idea because it sparks a wider conflict with Iran. Trump ended up getting away with it. Iran kept their response fairly, their retaliatory response fairly muted, but it gets really scary when suddenly you're telling the American people after what happened with the war in Iraq, where we were told, the intelligence is there, weapons of mass destruction, and we went to war, which then on faulty intelligence, to turn around then and say, oh, trust us, you've got to, you kind of need to do a little bit more than that.
Thank you. Our next question comes from YouTube, and the question is, have you found sources in the Pentagon or in the White House more or less willing to speak on or off the record to the media under Trump versus the Obama era? The follow-up to that is, objectively, are there more leaks now than in earlier administration, for example?
There are way more leaks with Trump than with Obama, first of all. But on the record, nobody likes to talk on the record. Okay, no government, they are all terrified of talking on the record. So you always start off the record with these people, and this includes the British diplomats we're talking to. This includes pretty much everybody you're talking to. You start off the record, and then you can work your way. We have off the record, we have deep background, we have background, and then we have on the record. Off the record is, I'm telling you this, but my name can't be anywhere near it, and you can't even use it. All you can do is see if you can go and confirm it somewhere else. I'm giving you knowledge, but that's it. Deep background is, I'm telling you this and you can use it, but you can't really say where you got it. background is, I'm telling you this, you can use it, you can quote me, but you can't quote me by name. You have to quote me as an administration official or a Pentagon official or a White House official. And then on the record, here's my name, here's what I do, I'm going to give this to you. The New York Times does not like off the record, but they recognize that, you got to start somewhere. The Times will not allow us with deep background. They really don't like that either. And so you really have to go out of your way to confirm it and get it in other places. Same thing even with background, our editors are they don't like using background quotes saying a senior administration official said blah, 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 blah. Other news organizations use it a lot. We use it very, very sparingly. Maybe like every once in a while you will see it if it's judged to be a big deal. And we always have to tell our editors in usually an encrypted phone call who our source is so that they know. And then it goes on the record. The problem with on the record is, that saying in Game of Thrones when Jon Snow said that Ed Stark says everything before the bud is bullshit. On the record is like, usually you're getting pablum. You're just getting the scripted, what they've kind of thought up. And this is the most mealy-mouthed way they can possibly say anything, which is why it's a constant battle between getting to what's real versus getting to what they will admit to saying. And that's why it goes back to what I was telling you about details, which is what, if you get a detail like Joe Biden was fingering rosary beads, you don't have to worry about whether that's on the record, because it's not about what he said, it's what he did. It's like, you don't have to worry that I have to then sort, I can source it into, and then people in the room said that he was doing this, but it's not about what he said, it's more about what we did. I have an editor, Andy Rosenthal, who when I was first coming to Washington to be the diplomatic correspondent, said to me, what you have to remember is to watch what they do, not what they say. And that's sort of what, when you're in Washington, it's like a lot of times it's different. It's a little different with Trump, but a lot of times, what they say is ignore. Just look at what they actually do.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Andy Laurie. Andy, if you'd like to give your question.
Thank you so much for your fascinating insights, and especially around Liberia. Really appreciate your openness in your experience there. My question relates to what you think as to the future moving forward around journalism and the whole post-truth, because we can look back to
post-truth.
Yeah, exactly, that word. But looking back to even back to George W. Bush administration with the reality-based community insult, which was a flag and a sign of the times. To even if Trump, let's say whether or not he stands for re-election in 4 years or whatever happens next, even without Trump on the scene, do you think that the future will continue to struggle with perhaps at times a tenuous link between a fact and what people believe or what people are willing to take on board?
This is such a brilliant question, and you're striking exactly at what I am most afraid of. I'm terrified of this whole idea of post-truth. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I hope that we're gonna get back to where facts matter. But I don't know if that's based on any real insight or any real, research. It's just me hoping, and I don't know that hope is a strategy. I think I'm going to keep reporting. I'm going to keep basing what I write about on what I report and what I can make sense of and the facts as I know them. I feel like that's all I can do. But it's hard to debate somebody you're not even operating from the same playbook at all. So I don't know. I feel a lot of what we've written, the New York Times has written so many stories over the last 4 years about Trump and about what this administration has been doing. And at the end of the day, you still saw 72 million Americans who decided that, they were okay with all of that. Either they were okay with all of that or they didn't believe it. And so I do think that as journalists, we have to ask ourselves be open to the idea that we've been doing something completely wrong. I just don't know what the answer. I know I'm stumbling all over the place to answer your question, but the truth is, I don't know the answer. I don't know what direction we're going to end up in. I hope it's one where facts are treated as facts. That's my hope.
Thank you. Our next question comes from James Braun. James?
Thank you very much, ma'am, for speaking with us today and your fascinating talk. Kind of coming off that last question, if you could speak directly to all of the Americans who think that you and the New York Times are fake news, what message would you have for them?
I don't know as a journalist if I think that way. That's a politician. I don't feel like as a journalist I'm here to send a message to all of the American people about anything. I think my job is to write what's happening around us and trust in our readers, to be intelligent enough to read it and go with it from there. There's a big reason why I got into journalism and not into politics, and that's to avoid that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question now, if I may. So building off a little bit Andy and James' question as well, talking about this idea of potential strategies for mending some of that distrust that we're seeing between the American public and the media. I wonder if you could talk about anything that comes to your mind in terms of things that could be done on that front, and as well what you think the relationship is between media companies being companies. They're for-profit, they're owned by individuals oftentimes that are looking to make a profit, etc. And what that might be like if, for example, there was more state-funded media or things of that sort, if that helps build trust or know if the distrust is coming from position with the government, if that makes sense. Thank you.
That's a good, I think that's an interesting area to plow. We have public TV and public radio here in the United States, not to the extent that you guys do, but we do have PBS, and that's very trusted. NPR is hugely trusted, but the people who watch it are the same type of people who read the New York Times. This is it's trusted, it's viewed as one of the most reliable and most trustworthy sources, but the audience for public radio is very much a center to center left, highly educated, New York Times type audience. Whereas the right-wing stuff and all the Rupert Murdoch radio shows and Fox and all of that is viewed as skewed, but that's what's widely read by people who are widely watched by people who are on the right. So people are all going off in their own silos, it feels like, and that's happening more and more. We don't have a center of gravity anymore. And I think that's something that journalism will have to reckon with, is this idea that the whole sitting in front of your TV at night watching Walter Cronkite on the news was considered to be, and when something happened, you're like, oh, that's gonna kill this politician, or that the shame of that. But now the shame factor seems to be gone as well. So there's a lot that you can there are a lot of areas for us to sort of research and look at. There is one thing. I mean, after the 2016 election, when Trump beat Hillary, the New York Times held almost like a reckoning. Like, how did we miss that this was going to happen? How did we not see that this whole segment of the American population, all those people who voted for Obama in 2012 and 2008, and then turn around, how do you go from voting for Barack Obama to voting for Donald Trump? And so we started going into a lot of these communities that have been neglected, a lot of these Midwestern places in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania that we hadn't, tried to talk to people. We have reporters who are with the Trump base all the time. We cover his rallies. We are talking to Trump supporters. If you read our newspaper, you will see story after story after story about their point of view, which is only fair. So you can, and there is an effort being made at the Times, and I think with many other organizations, to understand where some people are coming from and where these grievances that are being felt. But you can't do that in this rush to understand one side of the population, ignore then where the majority, and it is, if you look at just the numbers, where the majority of the American population is. And so it's a balancing act that you have to cut, and it's every day it's a challenge of how do you manage to include one side while not ignoring the other.
Graham, do you have a question?
I do, yes. Can you comment upon the outlook for reporting on China? Because as time goes on, it becomes more important that some information is exchanged between the US and China. So what do you think the outlook is for reporting on China?
As you know, the Chinese, through the New York Times through our reporters it's been happening over a period of, it's been a gradual thing, but now we've moved, most of our reporters have been moved out of China. They've been forced to leave. We're having issues in Hong Kong. We're reporting on China out of Seoul right now. There's a big bureau that has gone up there. So we're definitely having huge issues right now with reporting out of China. It doesn't mean we're not going to report it. We still have people there. We still have, and we still have managed to find ways to get in and out. We've still managed to tell incredible stories about coronavirus from, talking to the Chinese people. Like the work that our Chinese correspondents have still managed to do despite the challenges that they have now, I think has been amazing. I take my hat off to them, and we'll still we'll work around it, and we'll find a way, and hopefully we'll get back in again soon enough. But it makes the issue that you're bringing out really difficult.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question now from Sam Gibson. Sam?
Thanks for the discussion so far. I wanted to go back to something you spoke about earlier in your talk about reporting on Ebola in Liberia and sort of the cultural and obviously very human difficulties that come about in preventing the disease spreading, and why it is you think that Western societies seem to be struggling so much due to their culture in obeying simple sort of coronavirus prevention rules right now.
You're touching right on something that I ask myself every day. I'm a little frustrated with us right now in the West. I understand that this idea, I'm particularly frustrated with us in the United States. I understand this idea of individual liberty that governs the American psyche, but it doesn't make sense to me, the whole idea that I can't wear a mask to protect somebody else. Because that's saying I'm not going to wear a seatbelt, or I'm not going to stop at a stop sign because it's my personal choice to drive like a crazy person. And it's not. I worry this is all about a lack of empathy. I think that's the fundamental problem that we're having. The mask thing is not about protecting yourself. So people who think that they're going to be fine with coronavirus are not being asked to wear a mask to protect themselves. They're being asked to wear a mask to protect those who won't be fine if they catch coronavirus. And I think people are having trouble getting their head around that. And I think that's just selfish. I think at the heart of our Western culture is a level of selfishness that I'm just completely fed up with. I'm not giving you a journalistic answer. I'm just answering you from what I think. And I'm just over us.
Thank you, and well put. We've got another question here from YouTube, which says, Helene, can you speak to the Trump phenomenon of sources telling you something and then those or other sources claiming you fabricated that information? Did this happen in the Obama and Bush era?
Yes, it did. It happened with Bush. It happened with Obama. It happened with Trump. Every administration does it. It happened to me in the Obama administration in a huge way in 2012 when I broke a story about Iran, in fact. And I broke a story that the US had started secret talks with top Iranian leaders. And it was all the beginnings of the lead up to the whole Iran nuclear deal. But this was back in 2012, before, when the whole idea of American officials talking to Iranians was like, unheard of. And we wrote a story that ran on the front page. I got an initial tip from somebody outside, but my sources were ironclad. We had sources. I did the story with Mark Landler, who is now the London bureau chief of the New York Times. And our sources were rock solid. And then the story ran, and it was in the middle of an election season. Obama was running against Mitt Romney, and he had a debate. The story ran that Sunday, and he had a debate against Romney on Monday. And the White House was like, we don't know what the New York Times story is talking about. At first they said, and then they started saying, oh, it's not true. And I had sources that I'd gotten the story from within the White House. And they were telling me, you were a little bit over your skis. And by that they mean, in their view, I went like one word, maybe I said in discussions where there are ways to take apart a story where you deny it, but you're not actually denying it, where you say, there have been no formal talks, and they were doing this whole, we have had no formal talks. And that's where, but they're denying it without denying it. But anyway, Obama then goes to his debate with Mitt Romney, and the question comes out, and he says, the New York Times story was totally inaccurate, blah, 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 blah. And everybody turns, I remember and everybody turns and looks at me, and I'm like fuming. And then like 2 minutes later, Obama says, but if we were talking to Iran, why would that be so bad? And it's like he's kind of tripped himself up, and they weren't ready to be out with it. But it's like, but that kind of stuff happens to reporters all the time. I mean, it's one of those things where you always want to be first. You want to break the story. But if you break it before they're ready for you to break it, 50% of the time, they're going to deny it. And that's just the way you wait for vindication when, you find out a year later that here they are talking, and they had been talking.
Thank you so much. I recognize we're coming up on the hour, so I'll read out our last question here then. It reads, how has your job as a reporter for print newspaper changed as social media have become increasingly preferred as a source of news by many, especially by young people? Thank you.
My job hasn't changed, but my delivery, I think the delivery of the job has changed. It's funny because the print newspaper is what I grew up on, and we read the paper, your story shows up on the front page, and that was a big deal. And none of my younger friends ever see anything I put in the print newspaper. They'll see me if I go on TV, but where they really see me is on the daily podcast with Michael Barbaro, and that's not see, they hear me. And it's so funny because when I go on the daily with Barbaro, he has listeners like all over. People play him during their workout routines in the morning. He's like all over the place. And then I get inundated with stuff from all my cool millennial friends and all of that saying, we heard you on the daily and that sort of thing. And usually if I'm on the daily, it's like for 30 minutes breaking down an issue, but it's a subject that I've been writing about daily, showing up in the newspaper every day. And then all of a sudden it's like I show up to talk about it on the daily, and that's where people hear it. I think for reporters, we've got to learn, the different ways of getting our product out to the people we want to read. And we've got to figure out a way to look for a younger audience, which is why I applaud Michael Barber on the daily every single day, and I listen to him every day as well.
Thank you. I think I saw one more hand go up. I'll just quickly check. Damon, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
No, my question was just answered about social media. Thank you.
Okay. Well, in that case, I want to say, first of all, a huge thank you, Helene, for that fascinating overlook and very interesting look into what media looks like today and all the complexities that go with it. And as always, thank you to all of our members and our audience for asking fascinating, thought-provoking questions that you did. If you enjoyed that and you'd like to join us for our event next week, it'll be same place, same time, 7 p.m., where we'll be having Professor Iftikhar Malik, who's going to be discussing Afghanistan in Southwest Asia, a search for peace, reconciliation, and security. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you to everyone and good night.